Think about the last time someone said something that hit a nerve. Maybe it was a coworker who undermined you in a meeting. A partner who said the wrong thing at the wrong time. A friend who dismissed something that mattered deeply to you. Or maybe it was a stranger online who said something so disrespectful, you felt your blood pressure rise before you even finished reading it. What happened next? Did you fire back? Did you say something you later regretted? Did you slam a door, send an angry message, or make a decision in the heat of the moment that cost you your peace, your reputation, your relationships, or your opportunities? If you did, you are not alone. And you are not weak. You are human. But here is what no one tells you, that single second. That one moment between what happened and how you responded. That is where your entire life is either won or lost. Most people go through their entire lives never realizing this. They move from one reaction to the next, like a pinball being bounced around by circumstances, by other people's words, by situations they cannot control. They believe that reacting is honesty. That speaking their mind the moment they feel something is strength. That silence means weakness, and that holding back is the same as giving up. They are wrong. The most powerful people on this planet, the most successful, the most respected, the most emotionally free, are not the loudest in the room. They are not the fastest to respond. They are not the ones who always have to have the last word. They are the ones who have mastered the pause. They have learned something that most people will spend a lifetime never understanding, that you cannot control what happens to you, but you have total control over how you respond to it. And in that gap, that tiny, almost invisible space between stimulus and response, lies a power so profound it can change the direction of your relationships, your career, your finances, and your entire life. This audiobook is about that power. It is called The Power of Not Reacting, and before you misunderstand what that means, let's be clear about what it is not. Not reacting does not mean becoming cold. It does not mean suppressing your feelings or pretending that nothing bothers you. It does not mean becoming a doormat, accepting disrespect, or removing yourself from every difficult conversation. What it means is this: you become the one who chooses. You stop being a passenger in your own emotional life and start becoming the driver. You stop letting your emotions make your decisions and start letting your values, your vision, and your wisdom lead the way. That shift, from reactive to intentional, is one of the most important transformations a human being can make. In the chapters ahead, you are going to discover why your brain was literally designed to overreact, and why that is not a flaw but a feature you can learn to work with. You are going to understand the real hidden cost of impulsive reactions, not just emotionally, but financially, professionally, and in your relationships. You will learn how to identify the triggers that control you before they get the chance to use you. You will be introduced to tools, strategies, and mental frameworks that will allow you to pause, think, and respond with clarity and intention in even the most heated moments of your life. You will also learn something that most self-help content completely ignores, that holding back is not the same as holding in. That there is a critical difference between emotional mastery and emotional suppression, and that getting this wrong can be just as damaging as losing control. And by the time you reach the final chapter, you will walk away with a complete system, a way of thinking, a set of daily practices, and a personal standard for how you show up in the world, that will make you someone that life simply cannot rattle. Because here is the truth that this entire audiobook is built on. We live in the most reactive era in human history. Social media has turned outrage into entertainment. News cycles are engineered to trigger emotional responses. Conversations have become competitions. Disagreement has become war. And in the middle of all of this noise, the rarest and most valuable thing a person can possess is a calm, steady, unshakable mind. That calm is not something you are born with. It is something you build. It is a skill, a practice, a discipline, and like any discipline, it rewards those who commit to it with something most people are desperately searching for but rarely find. Peace. Clarity. Power. Freedom. Not the freedom to never feel anything, but the freedom to feel everything, and still choose how you act. That is what waits for you in these pages. So take a breath. And let's begin. Chapter 1, Why Your Brain Was Built to Overreact. Imagine you are driving home after a long day. You are tired. You are mentally drained. And then someone cuts you off in traffic, no signal, no warning, no apology. Just a sudden, aggressive swerve that forces you to slam on your brakes. In less than a second, something happens inside you. Your heart rate spikes. Your jaw tightens. Your hands grip the steering wheel harder. A wave of heat rises through your chest, and before you have even processed what just happened, you are already reacting, honking, muttering under your breath, or worse, deciding to speed up and return the aggression. You did not choose that reaction. It chose you. And that is exactly what we are going to talk about in this chapter, because until you understand why you react the way you do, you will never be able to change it. The first step to emotional mastery is not learning how to suppress what you feel. It is understanding where those feelings come from and why your brain generates them so fast, so intensely, and so automatically. The answer begins deep inside your mind, in a part of your brain most people have never heard of, but that controls more of their daily life than they would ever want to admit. Your brain is not one unified system. It is more like three distinct layers built on top of each other over millions of years of human evolution, each one serving a different purpose, each one operating at a different speed. The deepest and oldest layer handles your basic survival functions: breathing, heart rate, sleep. You do not think about these things. They simply happen. The second layer is where your emotions live. This is the limbic system, and at the center of it sits a small, almond-shaped structure called the amygdala. This tiny part of your brain is your internal alarm system. Its one and only job is to scan your environment at all times, looking for threats, and to trigger an immediate response the moment it detects danger. The third and most recently evolved layer is the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain located just behind your forehead. This is where rational thought lives. This is where you weigh consequences, consider options, make long-term decisions, and regulate your emotions. It is the most sophisticated part of the human brain, and it is what separates thoughtful response from impulsive reaction. Here is the problem. The amygdala is fast. The prefrontal cortex is slow. When a threat, real or perceived, enters your environment, the amygdala processes it in milliseconds and fires off a chemical response before your rational mind has even had a chance to register what is happening. Your body floods with cortisol and adrenaline. Your heart rate climbs. Your muscles tense. Your focus narrows. Everything inside you prepares for one of three responses: fight, flee, or freeze. This is what scientists call the amygdala hijack, a term coined by psychologist Daniel Goleman. It is the moment your emotional brain takes the wheel away from your rational brain, and it happens so fast that most people do not even realize it has occurred until after the damage is already done. Now here is where it gets important, because this system was not designed for the world you are living in today. The amygdala developed over hundreds of thousands of years when human beings were living in genuinely dangerous environments. When a rustling in the bushes could mean a predator. When a stranger approaching could mean a physical threat to your life. In those conditions, the ability to react instantly, without stopping to think, was not just useful. It was the difference between survival and death. Speed was everything. Hesitation could kill you. So your brain evolved to prioritize the emotional, reactive response over the slow, logical one. It evolved to shoot first and ask questions later. And for the environment it was built for, that was exactly the right design. But you are no longer living in that environment. You are living in a world where the threats you face every day are not lions or rival tribes. They are critical emails from your boss. A dismissive comment from someone you love. A social media post that challenges your identity. A business deal that falls through. A bill you cannot pay. A conversation that makes you feel disrespected or overlooked. None of these situations require a fight-or-flight response. None of them demand that you act in the next 3 seconds to survive. But your amygdala does not know that. It cannot tell the difference between a physical threat and an emotional one. It cannot distinguish between a predator in the wild and a coworker who undermined you in a meeting. To your amygdala, a threat is a threat, and it will respond to all of them the same way it always has. With speed. With intensity. With the full force of your survival instincts. And that is why you overreact. Not because you are immature. Not because you are weak. Not because something is fundamentally wrong with you. But because you are carrying a piece of ancient, life-saving technology inside your skull, technology that has not yet caught up with the complexity of modern human life. The ancient Stoic philosophers understood something about human emotion that modern neuroscience has only recently confirmed, and they understood it over 2,000 years ago without a single brain scan or laboratory. The Stoics taught that every emotional experience comes in 2 distinct waves. The first wave is involuntary. It is the initial physical sensation, the rush of heat, the tightening in your chest, the spike of irritation or fear or anger. You do not choose this wave. It arrives automatically, triggered by your nervous system, completely outside of your conscious control. The Stoics called these propatheiae, pre-emotions. They are not good or bad. They are simply biological. The second wave is where your power lives. The second wave is what you do with the first. It is the story you tell yourself about what just happened. It is the decision to escalate or to pause. It is the choice to let the emotion drive your behavior or to acknowledge it, examine it, and decide how you actually want to respond. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and one of history's greatest Stoic thinkers, wrote in his personal journal, a collection of private reflections we now know as meditations, that between every event and every response, there exists a space. A moment of choice. He trained himself, every single day, to find that space and to act from it deliberately. He was not trying to eliminate his emotions. He was trying to master them. And that distinction is everything, because mastery and elimination are not the same thing. You are not trying to become someone who does not feel. You are becoming someone who feels deeply and still chooses wisely. You might be reading this and thinking, this is interesting, but what does brain science have to do with my actual life? Everything. Every relationship you have is shaped by how you respond in moments of emotional intensity. Every professional opportunity you pursue or lose is influenced by how you carry yourself under pressure. Every financial decision you make while angry, anxious, or afraid is colored by a brain that is in survival mode rather than strategic mode. Research in the field of emotional intelligence consistently shows that people with higher emotional regulation, people who have learned to manage the gap between trigger and response, earn more, lead better, experience healthier relationships, and report significantly higher levels of life satisfaction than those who have not developed this skill. This is not soft science. This is measurable, documented, real-world impact. When you lose control of your emotions, you do not just damage the moment. You damage your reputation, your relationships, your opportunities, and your own sense of self-worth. You make decisions from a place of fear and anger that you would never make from a place of clarity and calm. And over time, those decisions compound, quietly, invisibly, relentlessly, into a life that feels harder and smaller than it should. But the reverse is also true. When you learn to regulate your emotional responses, when you train yourself to find that space between stimulus and response, something begins to shift. Conversations that used to derail you start to feel manageable. Situations that used to consume you start to lose their grip. People who used to have power over your mood start to lose that power. And decisions that used to be driven by emotion start to be driven by intention. You become, in the truest sense of the word, free. Understanding the science is powerful. But knowledge without application is just entertainment. So before we move into the next chapter, here is something concrete you can take with you today. The next time you feel a strong emotional reaction rising inside you, whether it is anger, anxiety, frustration, or fear, do not try to fight it. Do not tell yourself you should not feel what you are feeling. Instead, simply name it. Research by neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman at UCLA found that the simple act of labeling an emotion, saying to yourself, "I am feeling angry right now," or "I notice I am anxious," activates the prefrontal cortex and reduces activity in the amygdala. In other words, naming what you feel literally shifts your brain from reactive mode into thinking mode. It is not magic. It is neuroscience. And it works. This one small practice, name it to tame it, is the beginning of everything we are going to build together in this audiobook. It is the first brick in the foundation of emotional mastery. You cannot control what triggers you. But you can learn to see the trigger coming. You can learn to name what you feel. And in that naming, you begin to reclaim the power that your amygdala has been quietly stealing from you your entire life. That power starts here. Chapter 2, The Hidden Cost of Reacting, What You're Losing Every Day. There is a certain kind of loss that never shows up in your bank account. It does not arrive as a bill in the mail. It does not announce itself with a notification or a phone call. It does not come with a receipt or a timestamp. And because of that, most people never connect it to the moment it was created, that split second when emotion took over and reason stepped aside. But make no mistake. The cost is real. Every time you react impulsively, every time you fire off an angry message, escalate a conflict that could have been de-escalated, make a financial decision from a place of fear or frustration, or say something in the heat of the moment that you cannot take back, you are paying a price. Sometimes that price is small. Sometimes it is enormous. But it is always being paid, whether you are aware of it or not. This chapter is about making that cost visible. Because one of the most powerful motivators for change is not inspiration. It is clarity. When you can clearly see what your reactions are actually costing you, in your relationships, your career, your finances, and your own inner world, the desire to change stops being abstract and starts being urgent. So let us pull back the curtain and look honestly at what is at stake every single time you lose control of your response. Of all the areas of your life affected by reactive behavior, your relationships are where the damage runs deepest, and where it is the hardest to repair. Think about the nature of trust for a moment. Trust is not built in grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It is built slowly, quietly, through hundreds and thousands of small consistent moments where someone shows you who they are. And it is destroyed the same way, not always in one catastrophic event, but gradually, through a pattern of reactions that erode the sense of safety another person feels around you. When you are consistently reactive, when the people closest to you never quite know which version of you they are going to get, they begin to protect themselves. They stop sharing certain things with you because they are not sure how you will respond. They start walking on eggshells, choosing their words carefully, managing your emotions before they manage their own. The relationship does not end. It just quietly shrinks. It becomes smaller, safer, more surface level, and both of you feel the distance even if neither of you names it. And in the moments where a reaction crosses a line, where anger says something cruel, where frustration becomes aggression, where pride refuses to back down in a situation that called for humility, the damage can be irreversible. Words spoken in anger have ended marriages. Outbursts in moments of stress have permanently altered the way a child sees their parent. Reactions made from wounded ego have destroyed friendships that took years to build. The people who love you are not keeping score in a spreadsheet. But they are keeping score. Every human being has a threshold, a point at which they quietly decide that the cost of staying close to someone is higher than the benefit. And reactive behavior pushes people toward that threshold faster than almost anything else. Here is the painful truth: you may not even realize it is happening until someone is already gone. Now let us talk about what reactive behavior is costing you in your career and your professional life, because this is an area where the numbers are concrete and the consequences are swift. In any professional environment, your reputation is your most valuable asset. Not your skills. Not your qualifications. Not even your results. Your reputation, the way people experience working with you, the impression you leave in high-pressure moments, the way you conduct yourself when things go wrong, is what ultimately determines how far you go and how fast you get there. And nothing damages a professional reputation faster than emotional volatility. Consider what happens when someone reacts poorly under pressure at work. They snap at a colleague during a stressful project. They respond defensively to constructive feedback. They send an emotionally charged email that was never meant to be as sharp as it came across. They lose their composure in a meeting when challenged by someone they disagree with. In each of these moments, something shifts in the room. People take note. They do not necessarily say anything. But they file it away. And the next time a high-stakes opportunity comes up, a promotion, a leadership role, a critical project, the decision-makers in that room will remember. Not because they are cruel or unfair, but because leadership, at its core, requires the ability to remain clear-headed under pressure. And what they witnessed told them something important about whether you can be trusted with more. Reactive people get passed over. Not always. Not immediately. But consistently, quietly, and inevitably. Beyond the workplace, reactive behavior in business and entrepreneurship carries an even steeper price. Deals are lost because someone negotiated from emotion rather than strategy. Partnerships dissolve because a conflict was escalated instead of managed. Clients walk away not because the product was bad, but because the interaction left them feeling unsafe or disrespected. Opportunities disappear not because they were never there, but because the behavior in one critical moment made the other person decide the relationship was not worth pursuing. In the professional world, how you respond when things go wrong is often more important than whether things go right. And reactive behavior in those moments does not just cost you the moment, it costs you the relationship, the reputation, and everything those things could have become. This connection is one that almost no one talks about in the context of emotional control, but it is one of the most significant. Your financial decisions are not made in a vacuum. They are made by a human being who is operating inside an emotional state. And the research on this is unambiguous. When your emotional brain is activated, your financial decision-making deteriorates dramatically. Think about the last time you made a purchase out of frustration, boredom, or the need to feel better after a difficult day. Retail therapy is a real phenomenon, and it is driven entirely by the same emotional reactive patterns we have been discussing. A moment of stress leads to a decision that looks irrational in hindsight but felt completely justified in the moment. Now scale that up. Think about the person who quits a job impulsively in a moment of anger, without a backup plan, without savings, without thinking through the consequences, because their pride could not tolerate one more day of feeling disrespected. Think about the investor who panics during a market downturn and sells everything at a loss because fear overwhelmed their strategy. Think about the entrepreneur who burns a bridge with a valuable partner because ego refused to allow a moment of vulnerability or compromise. These are not small decisions. These are life-altering financial consequences that were born entirely from a failure to pause. Financial intelligence and emotional intelligence are more connected than most people realize. The ability to delay gratification, to think long-term rather than short-term, to hold a strategy even when the emotional pressure to abandon it is intense, these are all emotional regulation skills wearing a financial mask. And without them, even people with strong financial knowledge consistently make poor financial choices. The most successful investors, entrepreneurs, and wealth builders in the world share one overlooked trait: they have learned to take emotion out of their most important decisions. Not because they do not feel anything, but because they have trained themselves to feel without letting those feelings dictate their actions. Beyond the external losses, the relationships, the career opportunities, the financial consequences, there is a cost that lives entirely on the inside. And in many ways, it is the heaviest one of all. When you are a reactive person, you are never truly at rest. Every environment becomes a potential trigger. Every interaction carries a background hum of tension. Every difficult person in your life holds a kind of invisible power over you, the power to ruin your mood, derail your day, pull you out of your peace with a single word or action. You are, in the most literal sense, at the mercy of the world around you. And that is exhausting. There is also the weight of regret. Because reactive behavior almost always creates it. The words said in anger that you would give anything to take back. The decisions made in frustration that you are still paying for months or years later. The relationships damaged or destroyed in moments that, with just a few seconds of pause, could have gone entirely differently. Regret is one of the heaviest emotional burdens a human being can carry, and impulsive reactivity is one of its most reliable generators. Then there is the quiet erosion of self-respect. Because deep down, you know. Every time you lose control and later wish you had not, every time you react and then look back on that reaction with shame or embarrassment, a small piece of your confidence in yourself gets chipped away. You begin to see yourself as someone who cannot be trusted with their own emotions. Someone who says things they do not mean. Someone who lets other people and situations have too much power over who they are. Over time, that self-image becomes a story you tell yourself, and you begin to live inside that story in ways that limit you far beyond any single reactive moment. Here is what all of this is leading to, and this is important. Every cost we have just talked about shares one common origin point. Not a difficult childhood. Not a toxic environment. Not the people who trigger you or the situations that set you off. The origin point is the unmanaged space between what happens and how you respond. That space, that fraction of a second where the reaction is born, is also where the solution lives. And the moment you begin to take ownership of that space, everything on this list begins to change. Not overnight. Not perfectly. But consistently, progressively, and powerfully. The relationships start to heal because people begin to feel safe around you again. The professional doors start to open because others begin to trust your judgment under pressure. The financial decisions start to improve because you are making them from clarity rather than crisis. And the internal world, the peace, the self-respect, the sense of being in control of your own life, begins to return. This is not a small shift. This is a complete recalibration of how you move through the world. And it begins with understanding what you are losing, which you now do. So the question is no longer whether change is worth it. The question is, how soon are you willing to start? If this audiobook is adding value to your life, do not keep it to yourself, share it with someone who needs to hear this. And if you are serious about training your mind and becoming mentally stronger, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell, because the next audiobook will go even deeper into the psychology of discipline and building an unbreakable mind. You already took the first step by being here. Do not stop now. Chapter 3: Know your triggers before they know you. There is a person in your life who can change your mood in seconds. Maybe it is someone at work. Maybe it is a family member. Maybe it is an ex-partner, an old friend, or someone you have to deal with regularly whether you want to or not. All they have to do is walk into the room, or send a single message, and something shifts inside you. Your chest tightens. Your guard goes up. Your patience shortens. And before the conversation has even properly begun, you are already on the defensive. Or maybe it is not a person at all. Maybe it is a situation. A certain tone of voice that instantly reminds you of someone who hurt you. A specific type of criticism that lands differently than other feedback. A feeling of being ignored or overlooked that triggers something far deeper than the moment itself seems to justify. Whatever it is, you know the feeling. That sudden, almost involuntary shift from calm to activated. From grounded to reactive. From the version of yourself you want to be to the version of yourself you are trying to leave behind. These are your triggers. And right now, if you have never examined them deliberately, they are running your life far more than you realize. Most people think of a trigger as simply something that makes them angry. But that definition is far too narrow, and it causes people to miss the majority of the triggers that are actually shaping their behavior every day. A trigger is any external stimulus, a word, a tone, a situation, a person, a memory, an environment, that activates a strong emotional response inside you. That response does not have to be anger. It can be anxiety, shame, defensiveness, sadness, the sudden urge to withdraw, the compulsive need to prove yourself, the instinct to attack before you can be attacked. Triggers come in many forms and they operate at many levels. Some are obvious, you know exactly what sets you off and why. But many are invisible. They operate beneath your conscious awareness, quietly pulling the strings of your behavior without you ever realizing it. You just know that certain situations consistently bring out a version of you that you do not particularly like, and you have never been able to fully explain why. The reason most people never resolve their reactive patterns is not because they lack willpower. It is because they are trying to fight a battle without ever studying the terrain. They are reacting to their triggers without ever taking the time to understand where those triggers came from, what they are really about, or what they are trying to protect. That changes today. To truly understand your triggers, you have to be willing to look beneath the surface of the present moment, because almost every significant emotional trigger you carry today has its roots not in what is happening now, but in what happened then. Your brain is a pattern recognition machine. From the earliest moments of your life, it has been cataloging experiences, particularly painful ones, and storing them as reference points for future situations. When something in your present environment resembles something from your past that caused you pain, fear, or humiliation, your brain does not stop to verify whether the threat is real. It simply fires the alarm. This is why a certain tone of voice can instantly transport you back to a moment of childhood criticism, even when the person speaking to you now has no intention of hurting you. This is why feeling ignored in a relationship can trigger a level of pain that seems disproportionate to the moment, because it is not just about this moment. It is about every other moment you ever felt invisible or unimportant. This is why public criticism at work can feel like a personal attack even when it was delivered professionally, because somewhere in your history, being wrong in front of others meant something much more dangerous than professional embarrassment. Your triggers are not random. They are deeply personal, highly specific, and almost always connected to an unresolved emotional experience from your past. Understanding this does not mean you have to spend years in therapy excavating every painful memory. But it does mean that the path to emotional mastery runs directly through self-knowledge. And self-knowledge begins with honest, deliberate examination. One of the most practical things you can do to begin understanding your own trigger landscape is to organize your triggers into categories. This takes something that feels overwhelming and unpredictable and turns it into something you can actually work with. There are 4 primary categories that most emotional triggers fall into. The first is people triggers. These are specific individuals whose presence, behavior, or communication style consistently activates a strong emotional response in you. It might be someone who is chronically dismissive, someone who always seems to compete with you, someone who reminds you of a person who hurt you in the past. People triggers are often the most powerful because they involve relationship dynamics, and our deepest emotional wounds are almost always relational in origin. The second category is situation triggers. These are specific circumstances or environments that reliably shift your emotional state. High-pressure deadlines. Public speaking. Being in a position of powerlessness or uncertainty. Conflict in group settings. Financial stress. These situations activate the same survival response as personal interactions, sometimes even more intensely, because they can feel completely outside of your control. The third category is word and tone triggers. Specific words, phrases, or tones of voice that carry emotional weight for you regardless of who is saying them or what context they are used in. Being told you are wrong. Being spoken to condescendingly. Hearing words associated with past criticism or rejection. The words themselves may be neutral, but the emotional charge attached to them from your personal history makes them anything but. The fourth category is identity triggers. These are perhaps the most subtle and the most powerful. Identity triggers are activated when something challenges your sense of who you are, your competence, your values, your reputation, your worth. When someone questions your intelligence, your integrity, or your ability, the reaction is not just emotional. It is existential. It feels like an attack on your very self, and the response it generates is often wildly disproportionate to what actually happened. Understanding which category your triggers fall into is the first step toward diffusing them. Now we move from understanding to action, because knowledge without application, as we said in the last chapter, is just entertainment. One of the most transformative practices you can adopt is what we will call emotional landscape mapping, a simple but powerful process of deliberately charting your own triggers so that you can see them coming before they have the chance to ambush you. Here is how it works. Start by thinking back over the last 30 days. Identify 3 to 5 moments where you had a strong emotional reaction, moments where you felt your composure slip, your patience break, or your behavior shift in a way you later questioned. For each of those moments, ask yourself 4 questions. What specifically happened? The exact trigger, not just the general situation. What did I feel in my body in that moment? Where did I feel it, and how intense was it? What story did I immediately tell myself about what was happening? And finally, does this feeling remind me of anything from my past? Write the answers down. Do not edit them. Do not judge them. Just observe. What you will begin to notice, often surprisingly quickly, is that your reactions are not random. There are patterns. The same categories of triggers keep appearing. The same emotional themes keep surfacing. The same stories keep being told. And once you can see those patterns clearly, you are no longer at their mercy, because you can anticipate them. This is the critical shift. Moving from being ambushed by your triggers to being able to see them approaching from a distance, like watching a storm form on the horizon rather than being caught in the middle of it with no warning. There is a concept used by elite athletes, special forces soldiers, and high-performance executives that applies directly to what we are talking about here. It is called mental preloading, the practice of mentally rehearsing how you will respond to a challenging situation before that situation arrives. When you know your triggers, when you have mapped your emotional landscape and identified the people, situations, words, and identity threats that consistently activate you, you can use that knowledge to prepare in advance. Before a difficult conversation with someone who consistently triggers you, you can take 2 minutes to mentally rehearse remaining calm. To remind yourself of what is actually at stake. To decide in advance what you will do if you feel the activation rising, whether that is taking a breath, pausing before responding, or excusing yourself briefly if you need to. This is not weakness. This is strategy. And it is exactly what the most emotionally intelligent people in the world do consistently. The difference between someone who is controlled by their triggers and someone who has mastered them is not that the second person no longer gets triggered. It is that they have done the work to know themselves deeply enough that nothing can surprise them into reacting in a way they will later regret. They have studied the terrain. They know where the landmines are. And they move through difficult environments not with fear or tension, but with awareness, preparation, and deliberate calm. Before we close this chapter, there is one thing that needs to be said clearly, because it is a trap that many people fall into when they begin the work of examining their triggers. Self-awareness is not self-criticism.
The goal of understanding your triggers is not to shame yourself for having them. It is not to build a case against yourself or to spend your energy beating yourself up for the ways your past has shaped your present. Every trigger you carry was created by an experience that was real. Every reactive pattern you have developed was once a form of protection, a way your mind and body learned to cope with pain or threat. You are not broken. You are not damaged. You are a human being who has lived a human life, and that life has left its marks on you, as it does on every person who has ever existed. The work of self-awareness is not about judgment. It is about understanding. And understanding, real, honest, compassionate understanding of who you are and why you respond the way you do, is the foundation upon which everything else in this audiobook is built. Know your triggers. Not to punish yourself for them, but to free yourself from them. Because the moment you can see the trigger clearly, it loses its power over you. And that is exactly where your freedom begins. Before we move forward, drop a number in the comments right now. Type 1 if you have ever said something in anger that you deeply regretted. Type 2 if you have ever lost an opportunity because of how you reacted in a moment of emotion. Let's see how many of us are in this together.
Chapter 4, The Pause, the most powerful tool you've never used. There is a tool available to every single human being on this planet. It costs nothing. It requires no equipment, no training program, no special environment, and no prior experience. It can be used anywhere, in the middle of a heated argument, in a high-stakes business negotiation, in a moment of personal crisis, or in the quiet privacy of your own mind when the pressure of life feels like it is closing in from every direction. It is available to you right now, in this very moment. And yet the vast majority of people never use it. Not because they do not have access to it, but because in the moments when it matters most, when the emotion is high, the stakes are real, and the pressure to react is at its peak, they forget it exists entirely. That tool is the pause. Not the hesitation of someone who does not know what to say. Not the silence of someone who is too afraid to speak. Not the withdrawal of someone who is avoiding a difficult situation. The deliberate, conscious, intentional pause, the act of creating space between what you feel and what you do, is one of the most powerful and underutilized tools in the entire human experience. And in this chapter, we are going to break it down completely. What it is, why it works, how to use it, and how to make it so automatic that it becomes your default response in even the most challenging moments of your life. In the last chapter, we talked about triggers, the people, situations, words, and identity threats that activate your emotional response. And in Chapter 1, we introduced the idea of the amygdala hijack, that lightning-fast moment where your emotional brain takes control before your rational mind has a chance to intervene. Now here is where everything we have been building comes together. Between the trigger and the reaction, there is a space. It is tiny. In real time, it feels like less than a second. But that space, however small it may seem, is not empty. It is full of potential. It is the exact location where the entire direction of a conversation, a relationship, a decision, or an outcome can be changed. The Austrian psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps and went on to become one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century, described this space with a clarity that has never been improved upon. He wrote that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom and our power to choose our response. That one idea, that freedom lives in the space between stimulus and response, is the philosophical foundation of everything this chapter is about. The pause is how you access that space. And accessing that space, consistently and deliberately, is how you transform from someone who reacts to someone who responds. We already know from Chapter 1 that the amygdala fires faster than the prefrontal cortex, the rational, decision-making part of your brain. The emotional response arrives before the thoughtful one. And in the absence of any intervention, the emotional response wins. But here is what the science also tells us, and this is the part that changes everything. The amygdala's initial flood of stress hormones, the cortisol, the adrenaline, the physiological surge that accompanies the trigger, has a lifespan. It does not last forever. In fact, research suggests that the initial chemical response triggered by an emotional stimulus begins to dissipate within approximately 90 seconds if you do not continue to feed it with more reactive thoughts. 90 seconds. That is how long the pure biochemical storm lasts. After that, if the emotion continues, if the anger keeps burning, if the anxiety keeps spiraling, if the frustration keeps building, it is no longer being driven by the initial chemical response. It is being driven by your thoughts. By the story you are telling yourself about what happened. By the meaning you are attaching to the trigger. And thoughts, unlike biochemical responses, are something you can choose. This means that if you can create even a brief pause in the immediate aftermath of a trigger, if you can insert just a small amount of space between the stimulus and your response, you give the initial chemical storm time to begin settling. You give your prefrontal cortex time to come back online. And you shift from being driven by pure emotion to being guided by conscious choice. The pause does not eliminate the emotion. It creates the conditions in which you can choose what to do with it. Understanding the pause conceptually is valuable. But what you need are practical, specific tools that you can reach for in real moments of emotional intensity. Here are 4 of the most effective techniques for creating the deliberate pause, each one backed by research and tested in real high-pressure environments. Technique 1, the 4-7-8 breath. This breathing technique, developed and popularized by integrative medicine physician Dr. Andrew Weil, is one of the fastest and most reliable ways to interrupt the stress response and activate the body's parasympathetic nervous system, your natural calm-down mechanism. Here is how it works. You inhale quietly through your nose for a count of 4. You hold your breath for a count of 7. Then you exhale completely through your mouth for a count of 8. That single cycle takes approximately 19 seconds. And in those 19 seconds, something measurable happens in your body. Your heart rate begins to slow. Your blood pressure begins to drop. The cortisol flooding your system begins to ease. And most importantly, your prefrontal cortex, the rational, decision-making part of your brain, begins to regain its footing. You do not need to announce that you are doing this. You do not need to close your eyes or sit in a special position. In the middle of a difficult conversation, you can simply pause for a moment, take one deliberate breath using this technique, and return to the interaction with a fundamentally different physiological state than the one you were just in. One breath. 19 seconds. Completely invisible to everyone around you. And powerful enough to change the entire outcome of what follows. Technique 2, the mental stop sign. This is a cognitive interruption technique, a way of using your mind to break the automatic chain reaction between trigger and response before it gains momentum. The moment you feel the activation rising, the heat in your chest, the tightening in your jaw, the surge of irritation or anxiety, you mentally visualize a bright red stop sign. Large. Clear. Impossible to ignore. And with that image, you give yourself one firm internal instruction: stop. Not forever. Not to avoid the situation. Just long enough to interrupt the automatic pattern. Just long enough to create a crack in the chain reaction where awareness can enter. This technique works because it leverages the brain's capacity for visualization. The brain responds to vivid mental images in ways that are physiologically similar to how it responds to real experiences. A clear, firm mental image of stopping genuinely activates neural pathways associated with behavioral inhibition. It literally helps your brain pump the brakes on the automatic response. Practice this when the stakes are low so that it becomes instinctive when the stakes are high. The more you use it, the faster and more automatic it becomes, until eventually, the stop sign appears before you even consciously summon it. Technique 3, the 10-second rule. Simple. Powerful. Immediately applicable in almost any situation. Before you respond to anything that has triggered a strong emotional reaction, before you send the message, make the statement, escalate the argument, or take the action, count silently to 10. 10 seconds. That is all. It sounds almost embarrassingly simple. And yet the research on impulse control consistently shows that even a brief delay between the impulse and the action dramatically reduces the likelihood of a decision that is later regretted. 10 seconds is enough time for the first wave of emotional intensity to begin losing momentum. It is enough time for a second thought to form. It is enough time for the question, is this the response I actually want to give? To surface in your mind. The 10-second rule is particularly powerful in digital communication, in text messages, emails, and social media responses, where the absence of real-time social pressure makes it even easier to react impulsively. Before you hit send on anything written in a moment of emotional intensity, count to 10. And then ask yourself whether the message you are about to send represents the person you are choosing to be. More often than not, you will rewrite it. Sometimes you will not send it at all. Technique 4, name it to tame it. We introduced this briefly in Chapter 1, but it deserves its full place here because it is one of the most research-supported emotional regulation techniques available. Developed from the work of neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman at UCLA, the name it to tame it technique is exactly what it sounds like, the practice of labeling your emotional state out loud or in your mind the moment you feel it activating. Not analyzing it. Not judging it. Not trying to change it. Simply naming it. I am feeling angry right now. I notice I am anxious. I am experiencing frustration. That simple act of labeling, of putting language to the emotional experience, has been shown in neuroimaging studies to reduce activity in the amygdala and increase activity in the prefrontal cortex. In other words, naming the emotion literally shifts the balance of power in your brain from the reactive center to the reasoning center. It works because language is a function of the prefrontal cortex. The moment you engage language to describe your emotional state, you are activating the very part of the brain you need online in order to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. You are not suppressing the emotion. You are not denying it. You are simply shining the light of awareness on it, and in that light, its power to control your behavior begins to diminish. Here is the honest reality about all 4 of these techniques. Knowing them is not enough. Reading about them will not change your behavior in the moments that matter. The only thing that will change your behavior in those moments is practice. The reason most people fail to pause in high-intensity moments is not because they forgot the technique. It is because the technique was never practiced enough to become automatic. And when the emotional brain is activated and the pressure is real, you will not reach for something unfamiliar. You will reach for whatever is most deeply ingrained. This means you have to practice the pause when you do not need it, so that it is available to you when you do. Practice the 4-7-8 breath every morning before you begin your day. Not because you are stressed, but because you are building the muscle. Practice the mental stop sign during minor irritations, the small daily frustrations that do not really matter, so that it becomes reflexive. Practice naming your emotions during low-stakes moments so that the habit is established before the high-stakes ones arrive. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself based on repeated experience, is the science that makes all of this possible. Every time you choose the pause over the reaction, you are not just making a better decision in that moment. You are laying down a new neural pathway. You are, literally, rewiring your brain to default toward calm rather than toward chaos. And the more consistently you do it, the less effort it requires, until one day, without even thinking about it, you realize that the pause has become who you are. Let us bring this into the practical reality of your daily life, because the pause is not just a meditation concept or a therapy tool. It is a real-world strategy with real-world consequences. In a heated argument with someone you love, the pause is what prevents you from saying the thing you cannot take back. It is what keeps the conversation from escalating into a conflict that damages the relationship. It is what allows you to hear what the other person is actually saying rather than just reacting to how it made you feel. In a professional setting under pressure, the pause is what separates the leader from the reactor. It is what allows you to respond to criticism with grace rather than defensiveness. It is what makes people trust your judgment because they have seen you hold your composure when others would have lost theirs. In your financial life, the pause is what stops you from making the impulsive purchase, the panic-driven investment decision, the emotionally motivated business choice that looks disastrous in hindsight. It is the difference between a decision made from clarity and a decision made from crisis. And in your inner world, the pause is what gives you back the one thing that reactive living quietly steals from you every single day. Your sense of being in control of yourself. Not controlled by circumstances. Not controlled by other people. Not controlled by old wounds and unexamined patterns. In control. Grounded. Present. Deliberate. That is what the pause gives you. And it was available to you all along. Chapter 5, Silence as Strategy, the most powerful thing you can say. There is a moment in almost every heated conversation where one person says something, and the other person says nothing. Not because they have nothing to say. Not because they are afraid, or confused, or caught off guard. But because they have made a deliberate, conscious decision that their silence, in this particular moment, is more powerful than any words they could choose. Watch what happens in that moment. The person who spoke begins to feel the weight of what they said hanging in the air. The absence of an immediate reaction creates a kind of pressure, a vacuum that the human mind instinctively rushes to fill. They begin to second-guess themselves. They start to wonder whether they went too far, said the wrong thing, or misjudged the situation entirely. Sometimes they backpedal. Sometimes they over-explain. Sometimes they reveal far more than they originally intended, simply because the silence on the other side of the conversation made them uncomfortable enough to keep talking. And the person who said nothing? They are completely in control. This is the reality that most people never discover about silence, because most people have been conditioned to believe that silence is passive. That it is the absence of power rather than the presence of it. That the person who speaks most, argues loudest, and responds fastest is the one who wins. They could not be more wrong. Silence, used deliberately and strategically, is one of the most powerful communication tools available to a human being. And in this chapter, we are going to explore exactly why, and exactly how to use it in your relationships, your professional life, your negotiations, and your daily interactions in a way that fundamentally shifts the dynamic of every room you walk into. We live in a world that rewards noise. Social media algorithms amplify the loudest voices. News cycles are driven by the most outraged reactions. Workplaces often mistake the most vocal person in the room for the most capable one. And in personal relationships, the person who argues most persistently is frequently, and mistakenly, perceived as the most passionate or the most committed. We have been taught, in 1,000 subtle and not so subtle ways, that speaking up is strength and staying quiet is weakness. That having the last word means winning. That if you do not immediately defend yourself when challenged, you must be guilty, uncertain, or afraid. And so we talk. We react. We fill every silence with words, not because the words are necessary, but because the silence feels dangerous. It feels like losing. It feels like an admission of something we are not willing to admit. But consider this, in almost every high-stakes human interaction, the person who talks the most reveals the most. And the person who reveals the most holds the least power. Negotiators know this. Therapists know this. Lawyers know this. The most experienced and effective communicators across every discipline understand that silence is not a void to be filled, it is a force to be wielded. The Stoic philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome placed an extraordinarily high value on the discipline of silence, and they understood its power in a way that feels remarkably modern. Epictetus, a former slave who became one of the most influential Stoic teachers in history, taught that we should be more sparing with our words than with our money. He understood that speech, like currency, loses its value when it is spent carelessly. That every word spoken without deliberate intention is a small withdrawal from the account of your credibility, your influence, and your authority. Marcus Aurelius, in his private journals, repeatedly returned to the theme of restraint in speech. He wrote about the importance of not being reactive in conversation, of choosing to observe rather than immediately respond, to listen rather than immediately counter, to allow space rather than immediately fill it. And Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoic philosophy, is reported to have said that the reason we have 2 ears and 1 mouth is so that we may listen twice as much as we speak. These were not men who were afraid of conversation. They were emperors, teachers, and leaders who understood that the quality of what you say is always more important than the quantity, and that silence, chosen deliberately, speaks louder than most words ever could. One of the most powerful applications of strategic silence is in the middle of conflict, and this is where most people struggle the most, because conflict activates the very reactive impulses we have been working to master throughout this audiobook. When someone says something that triggers you, when they accuse you of something, challenge your character, dismiss your perspective, or provoke you with words designed to get a reaction, every instinct in your body will push you to respond immediately. To defend yourself. To counter the argument. To make sure they know that you are not going to just sit there and take it. But here is what actually happens when you respond immediately in those moments. You give the other person exactly what they were looking for. You confirm that they have the power to activate you. You escalate the conflict rather than de-escalating it. And you almost always say something that you would have said differently, or not at all, if you had given yourself even 30 more seconds to think. Now consider what happens when you do not respond immediately. When you hear what was said, hold it for a moment, and meet it with calm, deliberate silence. The dynamic shifts entirely. The other person expected a reaction. They prepared for it. They had their next response ready, designed to counter whatever you were going to say. But you did not say anything. And now they are in uncharted territory, because you have responded to their emotional escalation with something they did not anticipate and do not quite know how to handle. Calm. There is something deeply disarming about a person who does not take the bait. Who does not rise to the provocation. Who simply holds their ground in silence and waits. It communicates, without a single word, that you are not threatened. That you are in control of yourself. That whatever they are trying to trigger in you is simply not being triggered. And that, the unspoken message that you are unbothered, is often the most powerful thing you could possibly communicate in that moment. If you want to understand just how powerful silence can be as a practical, real-world strategy, look at the world of negotiation, because nowhere is the strategic use of silence more studied, more practiced, and more consequential. Every experienced negotiator understands one fundamental principle: after you make an offer, you stop talking. Immediately. Completely. Without qualification, explanation, or elaboration. The moment you begin filling the silence after your offer, you begin negotiating against yourself. You start volunteering information the other party did not ask for. You reveal your anxieties, your flexibility, your desperation, all the things you want to keep hidden. And the other person, even without intending to exploit it, picks up on every single one of those signals and uses them. But when you make your offer and then go silent, when you hold that silence with calm confidence and simply wait for a response, something powerful happens. The pressure that silence creates falls entirely on the other side of the table. They feel compelled to fill it. And in filling it, they often reveal far more about their position, their flexibility, and their priorities than they ever intended. This principle extends far beyond formal business negotiations. It applies in salary discussions, in conversations about expectations in relationships, in any situation where two people are trying to reach an agreement and the distribution of information determines who holds the advantage. The person who is most comfortable with silence almost always holds the most power in a negotiation. Not because they are withholding information maliciously, but because their comfort with silence signals confidence, patience, and the absence of desperation. And those qualities are among the most persuasive forces in any human interaction. Beyond its strategic applications, silence serves a deeply personal function, one that is directly connected to everything we have discussed in the chapters before this one. Choosing silence in a moment of emotional activation is one of the most effective forms of emotional regulation available to you. When you feel the surge of a strong emotion, the anger, the defensiveness, the urge to strike back or prove yourself, and you consciously choose silence rather than reaction, you are doing several things simultaneously. You are creating the pause we talked about in the last chapter. You are giving the initial biochemical storm time to begin dissipating. You are preventing yourself from saying something you will later regret. And you are sending a powerful signal to your own nervous system, a signal that says, I am safe. I am in control. This situation does not require a survival response. That signal, repeated consistently over time, literally trains your nervous system to respond to emotional triggers with calm rather than chaos. You are not just making a better decision in the moment. You are building a new default setting, one where your first instinct in the face of provocation is not to fire back, but to pause, observe, and choose. Silence, in this sense, is not just a communication strategy. It is a daily practice of emotional self-mastery. Every time you choose it over impulsive reaction, you are strengthening the muscle of self-control. You are becoming, one small choice at a time, someone who cannot be easily rattled, someone whose calm is not a performance but a genuine reflection of who they have become. In the spirit of giving you real, honest, applicable wisdom, this chapter would be incomplete without acknowledging that silence is not always the right choice. And knowing the difference is just as important as knowing how to use it. Strategic silence is powerful when used in moments of emotional intensity, conflict, negotiation, and provocation. It is powerful when the alternative is a reactive response driven by emotion rather than intention. But silence becomes avoidance when it is used to escape necessary conversations. It becomes passive aggression when it is used to punish rather than to process. It becomes self-abandonment when it crosses into never speaking your truth, never expressing your needs, never advocating for yourself out of a misguided belief that keeping the peace always requires keeping quiet. The goal is not to become someone who never speaks. The goal is to become someone who speaks with intention, who chooses their words deliberately, delivers them calmly, and holds their silence confidently when silence serves better than speech. There is a version of silence that is strength and a version that is fear. The difference lies entirely in the intention behind it. Strength-based silence says, I am choosing not to respond right now because I am in control of this moment and I know that my silence serves better than my words. Fear-based silence says, I am not responding because I am afraid of conflict, afraid of my own emotions, or afraid of what will happen if I speak. Learn to tell the difference. Because one of them will transform your life, and the other one will simply add to the weight you are already carrying. There is a particular quality that the most respected, most influential, and most emotionally powerful people tend to share, and it is something you can observe in any room if you know what to look for. They are never the most reactive person present. They are rarely the loudest. They do not feel the need to fill every silence or win every argument. They speak when they have something worth saying, and when they do speak, people listen, not because of their volume, but because of the weight behind their words. That weight comes from discipline. From the practice of choosing silence over noise, intention over impulse, response over reaction. It is built over time, through thousands of small moments where the easier path was to react and the wiser path was to pause. And when you begin to walk that wiser path consistently, when silence becomes not something you reluctantly resort to but something you deliberately choose, something shifts in how the world responds to you. People begin to sense that you cannot be easily provoked. That you are not going to be manipulated into reacting. That your words, when they come, carry the full weight of your considered intention behind them. That is not just communication skill. That is power. Real, quiet, unshakable power. And it starts with the decision to say nothing, at exactly the right moment. Chapter 7, Emotional Debt, How Suppression Destroys You from the Inside. There is a particular kind of person that many people admire from the outside. They are calm. They are composed. They never seem to lose their temper. In the most heated moments, when everyone else around them is visibly affected, they appear unmoved. Unshakable. Almost untouchable. They absorb criticism without flinching, navigate conflict without escalating, and move through difficult situations with a stillness that seems almost superhuman. And then one day, without much warning, and often over something surprisingly small, they completely fall apart. The explosion is disproportionate. The emotional intensity is overwhelming. The people around them are shocked because nothing in the behavior they observe prepared them for this. And the person themselves is often just as surprised, ashamed, confused, and deeply unsettled by the force of what just came out of them. What happened? What happened is something that psychologists have studied extensively and that most self-help content gets dangerously wrong: the difference between emotional regulation and emotional suppression. Between genuinely processing what you feel and simply burying it so deep that it is no longer visible on the surface. Because here is the truth that this entire chapter is built on: emotions do not disappear when you ignore them. They do not dissolve when you push them down. They do not vanish because you decided they were inconvenient, inappropriate, or too vulnerable to express. They accumulate. They build up slowly, quietly, and invisibly, like a financial debt that you keep deferring without ever actually paying. And just like financial debt, the longer you avoid it, the heavier the interest becomes. Until one day the bill arrives, and it is far larger than anything you could have settled if you had dealt with it when it was still manageable. This is emotional debt. And in this chapter, we are going to talk about what it is, how it forms, what it costs you, and most importantly, how to begin paying it down in a way that frees you rather than destroys you. Before we go any further, we need to address something directly, because this audiobook is about not reacting, and there is a version of that message that some people will unconsciously translate into something harmful. Not reacting does not mean not feeling. The power of the pause, the strategic use of silence, the release of ego-driven responses. None of these practices are asking you to become someone who does not experience emotion. They are asking you to become someone who does not let emotion drive behavior automatically. Those are two profoundly different things. Emotional mastery is the ability to feel fully, to allow emotions to move through you with complete awareness, while choosing deliberately how and when and whether to act on them. It is the integration of emotional experience with conscious intention. Emotional suppression is something else entirely. It is the act of pushing emotions down before they have been acknowledged, processed, or understood. It is the habitual refusal to feel, dressed up, very convincingly, as the appearance of calm. From the outside, they can look identical. Both the emotionally masterful person and the emotionally suppressed person may respond to a difficult situation without visible reaction. But on the inside, the experience is completely different. The emotionally masterful person felt the emotion, named it, allowed it to move through them, and chose their response from a place of awareness and intention. The emotionally suppressed person felt the emotion, immediately labeled it as unacceptable or dangerous, pushed it beneath the surface, and responded from a place of control, that is, beneath the calm exterior, anything but controlled. One of these approaches builds genuine resilience. The other builds emotional debt. And knowing which one you are practicing may be one of the most important pieces of self-awareness you develop from this entire audiobook. Emotional debt does not form overnight. It is the product of a pattern, usually a long-standing one, of consistently choosing not to feel, not to process, and not to express what is genuinely happening on the inside. For many people, this pattern begins in childhood. In environments where emotional expression was discouraged, punished, or met with dismissal, where crying was weakness, anger was dangerous, and vulnerability was something to be ashamed of, children learn very quickly to suppress what they feel. They develop what psychologists call emotional avoidance as a coping strategy. And because it works in the short term, because it does reduce the immediate discomfort of difficult emotions, it becomes habitual. The problem is that what works as a child's survival strategy becomes a dysfunctional adult pattern. The emotional avoidance that once protected a vulnerable young person from an unsafe environment continues operating in adulthood even when the environment is no longer unsafe. The suppression that once served a purpose keeps running, not out of wisdom, but out of habit, long after the original threat has passed. Other people develop emotional debt through cultural or social conditioning. Men, in particular, are often socialized to believe that emotional expression is incompatible with strength, that acknowledging vulnerability, expressing sadness, or admitting fear is a form of weakness that undermines their authority or their masculinity. And so they suppress. They store. They carry the accumulated weight of years of unfelt emotion beneath a surface of composed, capable strength. And then there are the people who develop emotional suppression not from childhood or culture, but from a genuine, if misguided, desire to be better. They read about stoicism, about emotional control, about the power of not reacting, and they interpret those ideas as a permission slip to feel nothing. To disconnect from their emotional experience entirely in the pursuit of what they believe is discipline. Regardless of how the pattern formed, the result is the same. The emotions that were never felt do not disappear. They go underground. They take up residence in the body, in the nervous system, in the unconscious mind, and they express themselves in ways that their owner often cannot connect back to their emotional origin. One of the most insidious things about emotional debt is that its symptoms rarely look like what they actually are. People do not usually walk around thinking, "I am suffering because I have years of suppressed emotion that I have never processed." They experience the symptoms without understanding the cause. The first and perhaps most common symptom is chronic anxiety and low-level stress. When emotions are consistently suppressed rather than processed, the nervous system remains in a state of low-grade activation, a constant background hum of tension that never fully resolves. The person may not be able to identify a specific reason for their anxiety. They may describe it as simply feeling unsettled, on edge, or unable to fully relax. This is the nervous system carrying an emotional load that was never put down. The second symptom is physical illness. The connection between suppressed emotion and physical health is one of the most well-documented findings in psychosomatic medicine. Chronic suppression of emotions, particularly anger, grief, and fear, has been linked to elevated cortisol levels, weakened immune function, cardiovascular disease, chronic pain conditions, and a range of other physical health problems. The body keeps the score, as trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk famously observed, meaning that what the mind refuses to process, the body is forced to carry. The third symptom is emotional numbness. When you consistently suppress specific emotions, over time the suppression begins to generalize. You do not just stop feeling the difficult emotions, you gradually lose access to the positive ones as well. The joy becomes muted. The excitement becomes flat. The love becomes distant. This is not depression in the clinical sense, though it can develop into that. It is the emotional deadening that happens when a person has spent so long disconnecting from their inner experience that the connection itself begins to atrophy. The fourth symptom is the one we opened this chapter with: disproportionate emotional explosions. The eruption over something small that makes no sense to anyone involved, including the person erupting. This is emotional debt calling in its outstanding balance. The anger that seems wildly out of proportion to the current situation is not just about the current situation. It is about every previous situation that generated a similar emotion and was never allowed to be fully felt or expressed. The current trigger is simply the final straw, the moment the container could no longer hold what had been poured into it. The fifth symptom is relational disconnection. Emotional suppression creates distance, not just from your own inner experience but from the people in your life. Genuine intimacy requires vulnerability. It requires the willingness to be seen, not just in your strength and your composure, but in your uncertainty, your pain, and your need. When suppression has become habitual, vulnerability feels impossible. And without vulnerability, relationships remain surface level, functional, perhaps even pleasant, but never truly deep. The kind of connection that actually nourishes a human being becomes inaccessible. Here is where many people get stuck, because when they hear that suppression is harmful, they assume that the solution is simply to express every emotion they feel, in every situation, without restraint. That is not what emotional processing means. And in fact, unrestrained emotional expression can be just as damaging as suppression. It simply creates a different kind of problem. Venting, the act of repeatedly expressing a negative emotion without actually resolving the underlying experience, does not reduce the emotion. Research by psychologist Brad Bushman at Ohio State University found that venting anger, far from providing relief, actually amplifies it. The more you rehearse an emotional experience without processing it, the stronger and more entrenched it becomes. Real emotional processing is something different. It is the act of allowing an emotion to be fully felt and acknowledged, without judgment, without immediately acting on it, and without spinning it into a story that keeps it alive indefinitely. It is the difference between sitting with the feeling and being consumed by it. There are several powerful practices for genuine emotional processing that do not require you to express every feeling to every person in your life. The first is intentional journaling. Not the kind where you vent endlessly about what happened and why you were right and they were wrong. but the kind where you sit quietly with what you feel, name it specifically, trace it back to its origin, and ask yourself what it is telling you about what you need. This kind of writing engages the prefrontal cortex, activates emotional labeling, and creates the internal space for genuine processing rather than mere rehearsal. The second is physical movement. The body stores emotional tension in its tissues, in the shoulders, the jaw, the chest, the gut. Deliberate physical movement, whether that is exercise, walking, breath work, or any form of intentional physical activity, creates a discharge pathway for emotional energy that has been stored in the body. This is not metaphorical. It is physiological. Movement literally helps the nervous system complete the stress response cycle that suppression interrupted. The third is deliberate solitude. In a world that is constantly demanding your attention, your productivity, and your performance, one of the most radical acts of emotional self-care is simply to be alone, quietly, without distraction, and to allow yourself to feel whatever is present without immediately trying to fix it, analyze it, or make it go away. Many people discover, when they first practice this, that they have been using busyness as a form of suppression. That the constant activity, the endless scrolling, the perpetual noise in their environment has been serving the same function as any other avoidance strategy, keeping them from having to feel what is waiting beneath the surface. If you recognize yourself in this chapter, if you can see the patterns of suppression in your own life, and identify some of the ways that emotional debt has been expressing itself in your relationships, your body, or your behavior, the most important thing to understand is this. You do not have to resolve everything at once. Emotional debt, like financial debt, is paid down gradually. Through consistent, honest, compassionate engagement with your inner experience over time. Through the practice of feeling what you feel without immediately acting on it or immediately suppressing it. Through the development of a relationship with your own emotional life that is characterized by curiosity rather than judgment, by awareness rather than avoidance, and by the understanding that your emotions, all of them, including the uncomfortable ones, are not enemies to be defeated. They are information. They are signals from the deepest part of your experience, telling you something about what you need, what you value, what has been hurt, and what requires attention. The goal of this audiobook has never been to make you someone who does not feel. It has been to make you someone who feels with full awareness and acts with full intention. That integration, of deep feeling and deliberate action, is not just the foundation of emotional mastery. It is the foundation of a genuinely free human life. And you cannot build it by suppressing what you feel. You build it by having the courage, the real, quiet, unglamorous courage, to feel it all. And then choose, deliberately and wisely, what you do next. Chapter 7, Emotional Debt, How Suppression Destroys You from the Inside. There is a particular kind of person that many people admire from the outside. They are calm. They are composed. They never seem to lose their temper. In the most heated moments, when everyone else around them is visibly affected, they appear unmoved. Unshakable. Almost untouchable. They absorb criticism without flinching, navigate conflict without escalating, and move through difficult situations with a stillness that seems almost superhuman. And then one day, without much warning, and often over something surprisingly small, they completely fall apart. The explosion is disproportionate. The emotional intensity is overwhelming. The people around them are shocked because nothing in the behavior they observe prepared them for this. And the person themselves is often just as surprised, ashamed, confused, and deeply unsettled by the force of what just came out of them. What happened? What happened is something that psychologists have studied extensively and that most self-help content gets dangerously wrong: the difference between emotional regulation and emotional suppression. Between genuinely processing what you feel and simply burying it so deep that it is no longer visible on the surface. Because here is the truth that this entire chapter is built on: emotions do not disappear when you ignore them. They do not dissolve when you push them down. They do not vanish because you decided they were inconvenient, inappropriate, or too vulnerable to express. They accumulate. They build up slowly, quietly, and invisibly, like a financial debt that you keep deferring without ever actually paying. And just like financial debt, the longer you avoid it, the heavier the interest becomes. Until one day the bill arrives, and it is far larger than anything you could have settled if you had dealt with it when it was still manageable. This is emotional debt. And in this chapter, we are going to talk about what it is, how it forms, what it costs you, and most importantly, how to begin paying it down in a way that frees you rather than destroys you. Before we go any further, we need to address something directly, because this audiobook is about not reacting, and there is a version of that message that some people will unconsciously translate into something harmful. Not reacting does not mean not feeling. The power of the pause, the strategic use of silence, the release of ego-driven responses, none of these practices are asking you to become someone who does not experience emotion. They are asking you to become someone who does not let emotion drive behavior automatically. Those are two profoundly different things. Emotional mastery is the ability to feel fully, to allow emotions to move through you with complete awareness, while choosing deliberately how and when and whether to act on them. It is the integration of emotional experience with conscious intention. Emotional suppression is something else entirely. It is the act of pushing emotions down before they have been acknowledged, processed, or understood. It is the habitual refusal to feel, dressed up, very convincingly, as the appearance of calm. From the outside, they can look identical. Both the emotionally masterful person and the emotionally suppressed person may respond to a difficult situation without visible reaction. But on the inside, the experience is completely different. The emotionally masterful person felt the emotion, named it, allowed it to move through them, and chose their response from a place of awareness and intention. The emotionally suppressed person felt the emotion, immediately labeled it as unacceptable or dangerous, pushed it beneath the surface, and responded from a place of control, that is, beneath the calm exterior, anything but controlled. One of these approaches builds genuine resilience. The other builds emotional debt. And knowing which one you are practicing may be one of the most important pieces of self-awareness you develop from this entire audiobook. Emotional debt does not form overnight. It is the product of a pattern, usually a long-standing one, of consistently choosing not to feel, not to process, and not to express what is genuinely happening on the inside. For many people, this pattern begins in childhood. In environments where emotional expression was discouraged, punished, or met with dismissal, where crying was weakness, anger was dangerous, and vulnerability was something to be ashamed of, children learn very quickly to suppress what they feel. They develop what psychologists call emotional avoidance as a coping strategy. And because it works in the short term, because it does reduce the immediate discomfort of difficult emotions, it becomes habitual. The problem is that what works as a child's survival strategy becomes a dysfunctional adult pattern. The emotional avoidance that once protected a vulnerable young person from an unsafe environment continues operating in adulthood even when the environment is no longer unsafe. The suppression that once served a purpose keeps running, not out of wisdom, but out of habit, long after the original threat has passed. Other people develop emotional debt through cultural or social conditioning. Men, in particular, are often socialized to believe that emotional expression is incompatible with strength, that acknowledging vulnerability, expressing sadness, or admitting fear is a form of weakness that undermines their authority or their masculinity. And so they suppress. They store. They carry the accumulated weight of years of unfelt emotion beneath a surface of composed, capable strength. And then there are the people who develop emotional suppression not from childhood or culture, but from a genuine, if misguided, desire to be better. They read about stoicism, about emotional control, about the power of not reacting, and they interpret those ideas as a permission slip to feel nothing. To disconnect from their emotional experience entirely in the pursuit of what they believe is discipline. Regardless of how the pattern formed, the result is the same. The emotions that were never felt do not disappear. They go underground. They take up residence in the body, in the nervous system, in the unconscious mind, and they express themselves in ways that their owner often cannot connect back to their emotional origin. One of the most insidious things about emotional debt is that its symptoms rarely look like what they actually are. People do not usually walk around thinking, "I am suffering because I have years of suppressed emotion that I have never processed." They experience the symptoms without understanding the cause. The first and perhaps most common symptom is chronic anxiety and low-level stress. When emotions are consistently suppressed rather than processed, the nervous system remains in a state of low-grade activation, a constant background hum of tension that never fully resolves. The person may not be able to identify a specific reason for their anxiety. They may describe it as simply feeling unsettled, on edge, or unable to fully relax. This is the nervous system carrying an emotional load that was never put down. The second symptom is physical illness. The connection between suppressed emotion and physical health is one of the most well-documented findings in psychosomatic medicine. Chronic suppression of emotions, particularly anger, grief, and fear, has been linked to elevated cortisol levels, weakened immune function, cardiovascular disease, chronic pain conditions, and a range of other physical health problems. The body keeps the score, as trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk famously observed, meaning that what the mind refuses to process, the body is forced to carry. The third symptom is emotional numbness. When you consistently suppress specific emotions, over time the suppression begins to generalize. You do not just stop feeling the difficult emotions, you gradually lose access to the positive ones as well. The joy becomes muted. The excitement becomes flat. The love becomes distant. This is not depression in the clinical sense, though it can develop into that. It is the emotional deadening that happens when a person has spent so long disconnecting from their inner experience that the connection itself begins to atrophy. The fourth symptom is the one we opened this chapter with, disproportionate emotional explosions. The eruption over something small that makes no sense to anyone involved, including the person erupting. This is emotional debt calling in its outstanding balance. The anger that seems wildly out of proportion to the current situation is not just about the current situation. It is about every previous situation that generated a similar emotion and was never allowed to be fully felt or expressed. The current trigger is simply the final straw, the moment the container could no longer hold what had been poured into it. The fifth symptom is relational disconnection. Emotional suppression creates distance, not just from your own inner experience but from the people in your life. Genuine intimacy requires vulnerability. It requires the willingness to be seen, not just in your strength and your composure, but in your uncertainty, your pain, and your need. When suppression has become habitual, vulnerability feels impossible. And without vulnerability, relationships remain surface level, functional, perhaps even pleasant, but never truly deep. The kind of connection that actually nourishes a human being becomes inaccessible. Here is where many people get stuck, because when they hear that suppression is harmful, they assume that the solution is simply to express every emotion they feel, in every situation, without restraint. That is not what emotional processing means. And in fact, unrestrained emotional expression can be just as damaging as suppression, it simply creates a different kind of problem. Venting, the act of repeatedly expressing a negative emotion without actually resolving the underlying experience, does not reduce the emotion. Research by psychologist Brad Bushman at Ohio State University found that venting anger, far from providing relief, actually amplifies it. The more you rehearse an emotional experience without processing it, the stronger and more entrenched it becomes. Real emotional processing is something different. It is the act of allowing an emotion to be fully felt and acknowledged, without judgment, without immediately acting on it, and without spinning it into a story that keeps it alive indefinitely. It is the difference between sitting with the feeling and being consumed by it. There are several powerful practices for genuine emotional processing. The third is deliberate solitude. In a world that is constantly demanding your attention, your productivity, and your performance, one of the most radical acts of emotional self-care is simply to be alone, quietly, without distraction, and to allow yourself to feel whatever is present without immediately trying to fix it, analyze it, or make it go away. Many people discover, when they first practice this, that they have been using busyness as a form of suppression. That the constant activity, the endless scrolling, the perpetual noise in their environment has been serving the same function as any other avoidance strategy, keeping them from having to feel what is waiting beneath the surface. If you recognize yourself in this chapter, if you can see the patterns of suppression in your own life, and identify some of the ways that emotional debt has been expressing itself in your relationships, your body, or your behavior, the most important thing to understand is this. You do not have to resolve everything at once. Emotional debt, like financial debt, is paid down gradually. Through consistent, honest, compassionate engagement with your inner experience over time. Through the practice of feeling what you feel without immediately acting on it or immediately suppressing it. Through the development of a relationship with your own emotional life that is characterized by curiosity rather than judgment, by awareness rather than avoidance, and by the understanding that your emotions, all of them, including the uncomfortable ones, are not enemies to be defeated. They are information. They are signals from the deepest part of your experience, telling you something about what you need, what you value, what has been hurt, and what requires attention. The goal of this audiobook has never been to make you someone who does not feel. It has been to make you someone who feels with full awareness and acts with full intention. That integration, of deep feeling and deliberate action, is not just the foundation of emotional mastery. It is the foundation of a genuinely free human life. And you cannot build it by suppressing what you feel. You build it by having the courage, the real, quiet, unglamorous courage, to feel it all. And then choose, deliberately and wisely, what you do next. Chapter 8, Responding versus Reacting, How the Most Successful People Communicate. There are two people sitting across from each other in a difficult conversation. The stakes are real. The tension is present. Something has been said that landed badly, a criticism that stung, a disagreement that cut deeper than expected, a challenge that felt uncomfortably close to a personal attack. The air in the room has shifted. Both people can feel it. The first person feels the activation immediately. The heat rises. The jaw tightens. The mind starts racing, assembling arguments, rehearsing comebacks, preparing a defense. And before the other person has even finished speaking, the first person is already formulating their response. Not listening. Not processing. Not considering. Just loading the next thing they are going to say the moment there is a gap in the conversation wide enough to say it. When they finally speak, the words come fast. They are sharp. They are defensive. They address the surface of what was said without engaging with the substance underneath. And the conversation, rather than moving toward resolution, escalates. Both people are now reacting to each other's reactions. The original issue gets buried under layers of defensiveness and counterattack. And by the time it ends, nothing has been resolved. Both people feel worse than when it started. Now consider the second person in the same situation. They feel the activation too. The same heat. The same instinct to defend. But something different happens in the space between receiving the message and delivering a response. There is a pause, brief but deliberate. A breath. A moment of internal observation. And when they speak, something in the quality of their words is different. They are slower. More deliberate. They address what was actually said rather than what they feared was meant. They ask a clarifying question rather than launching a counterattack. They acknowledge what is valid in the other person's perspective before presenting their own. And the conversation, rather than escalating, begins to de-escalate. The tension softens. The other person feels heard. And both of them move toward a resolution that neither of them could have reached through reaction alone. The difference between these two people is not intelligence. It is not confidence. It is not even emotional sensitivity. It is the difference between reacting and responding. And in this chapter, we are going to break down exactly what that difference looks like in practice, and how the most successful communicators in the world have mastered it across every context of their professional and personal lives. We have touched on the difference between reacting and responding throughout this audiobook, but here, in a chapter dedicated entirely to communication, it is worth defining with complete precision. A reaction is automatic. It is the output of the emotional brain operating without the involvement of the rational mind. It is fast, unfiltered, and driven entirely by the immediate emotional state of the person delivering it. A reaction does not consider consequences. It does not weigh options. It does not ask whether it serves the larger goal of the interaction. It simply fires, driven by the need to defend, to attack, to escape, or to dominate. A response is intentional. It is the output of a mind that has registered the emotional input, created a brief but meaningful space between stimulus and action, and chosen a course of communication that serves the actual goal of the interaction. A response is not cold or disconnected. It can be warm, passionate, and deeply personal. But it is always chosen. Always deliberate. Always in service of something beyond the immediate emotional relief of getting the reaction out. The simplest way to distinguish between the two is this: a reaction serves the emotion. A response serves the outcome. And when you begin to consistently choose the outcome over the emotion in your communication, everything changes. Not just in the quality of individual conversations, but in the way people experience you, trust you, and choose to engage with you over time. In Chapter 2 we talked about the broad cost of reactive behavior across all areas of life. But in the specific context of communication, in the daily interactions that make up the fabric of your relationships and your professional life, the cost of reactive communication deserves its own examination. Because communication is not just the way you exchange information with other people. It is the primary mechanism through which you build trust, establish credibility, resolve conflict, create opportunity, and express who you are to the world. Every conversation you have is either building something or eroding something. And reactive communication, by its very nature, erodes. It erodes trust, because people cannot rely on a communicator who is unpredictable. When those around you know that a certain type of comment or situation will reliably trigger a defensive or aggressive response, they stop bringing those comments and situations to you. They route around you. They manage you. And the relationship, professional or personal, becomes shallower as a result. It erodes influence, because influence is built on the perception of reliability, thoughtfulness, and emotional stability. The person who reacts impulsively in important conversations may be passionate, may even be right, but they lose the credibility that comes from being perceived as someone who can be trusted to handle pressure without becoming unpredictable. It erodes opportunity, because in both business and personal life, the people who open doors for others are almost always people who feel safe doing so. And safety, in a relational context, is largely defined by how someone behaves in moments of tension and disagreement. Reactive communicators do not feel safe to those with the power to create opportunities. And so those opportunities quietly go to someone else. Understanding this is not about making you feel bad about past reactive communication. It is about giving you the clearest possible picture of what becomes available to you when you make the shift from reacting to responding. The field of emotional intelligence, pioneered by psychologists Peter Salovey and John Mayer and popularized by Daniel Goleman, has produced decades of research on what distinguishes the most effective communicators and leaders from their less effective counterparts. And the findings, across virtually every study and every context, point to the same cluster of behaviors. The most effective communicators listen more than they speak. They ask more questions than they make statements. They demonstrate genuine curiosity about the other person's perspective before presenting their own. They regulate their emotional responses in real time, not by suppressing what they feel but by choosing when and how to express it. And they consistently prioritize the quality of the relationship over the outcome of any single interaction. These are not personality traits that some people are born with and others are not. They are skills. Learnable, practicable, developable skills, and every single one of them is accessible to you through the practice of choosing response over reaction. Consider the communication style of some of the most respected leaders and communicators in modern history. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison for his political beliefs, an experience that would have broken most people and generated a lifetime of justified rage. Yet when he emerged from prison and eventually led his country, he was known above all else for his extraordinary capacity for measured, deliberate, non-reactive communication. He did not suppress his feelings about what had been done to him. But he chose, consistently and powerfully, how to express them, always in service of the larger vision rather than the immediate emotional relief of reacting. Oprah Winfrey built one of the most successful communication careers in history not on being the loudest or the most aggressive voice in any room, but on being the most genuinely present and the most carefully responsive. Her ability to make guests and audiences feel deeply heard, to respond to what was actually being said rather than to what she expected or wanted to hear, became the foundation of an influence that spanned decades. Warren Buffett, when asked about his communication philosophy in business, has consistently emphasized the importance of patience and deliberation. He does not respond to market panic. He does not react to criticism of his decisions. He responds, from a place of careful analysis, long-term thinking, and the emotional stability that comes from knowing exactly what he values and why. The through line across all of these examples is the same. Masterful communicators are not people who have eliminated their emotional responses. They are people who have developed the discipline to choose their responses with intention, and in doing so, they have built something that reactive communicators almost never achieve. Lasting trust. Now let us move from principle to practice, because understanding what responsive communication looks like is one thing, and having a concrete framework for how to do it in real situations is another entirely. Here is a 5-part framework for intentional response that you can begin applying immediately in any communication context, whether it is a difficult personal conversation, a professional disagreement, a high-stakes negotiation, or a moment of conflict that threatens to escalate. The first part is pause and breathe. We have covered this extensively in Chapter 4, but it bears repeating here in the communication context because it is the non-negotiable foundation of everything that follows. Before you respond to anything that has triggered a strong emotional reaction, create space. Even 3 to 5 seconds of deliberate pause changes the physiological state you are responding from. This is not hesitation. It is preparation. The second part is listen to understand, not to respond. This is perhaps the single most transformative shift available in human communication, and it is one that most people have never genuinely made. Most people, in most conversations, are not actually listening to what the other person is saying. They are waiting for a gap in the conversation so they can say what they were already planning to say before the other person finished speaking. Genuine listening, the kind where you are fully present, fully focused on understanding the other person's actual meaning and actual experience, is so rare that when people encounter it, they remember it. It builds trust faster than almost any other communication behavior. And it makes your eventual response infinitely more accurate, more relevant, and more effective. The third part is acknowledge before you advocate. Before you present your own perspective, position, or argument, before you disagree, counter, or correct, acknowledge what is valid in what the other person has said. Not as a manipulation tactic. Not as a way of softening them up before you attack. But as a genuine recognition that in almost every disagreement, both sides contain some portion of truth. Finding and naming that portion before presenting your own view signals intellectual honesty, emotional maturity, and a genuine commitment to understanding rather than winning. And it dramatically increases the likelihood that your perspective will be genuinely heard in return. The fourth part is speak to the issue, not the person. Reactive communication almost always drifts from the specific issue at hand into commentary on the other person's character, intelligence, or intentions. This is the moment a disagreement becomes a conflict, when the conversation stops being about what happened and starts being about what kind of person the other party is. Responsive communication stays anchored to the specific behavior, situation, or decision being discussed without extrapolating into sweeping judgments about the person's worth or character. This one discipline alone can prevent the majority of communication breakdowns that most people experience in their relationships and professional lives. The fifth part is choose your timing deliberately. Not every moment is the right moment for every conversation. One of the most overlooked aspects of responsive communication is the wisdom to recognize when a conversation should not happen yet, when the emotional temperature in the room is too high for anything productive to occur, when you or the other person are too activated to engage with genuine openness, or when the environment is not conducive to the kind of honest, vulnerable exchange that the conversation actually requires. Choosing to pause a conversation and return to it when both parties are in a better state to engage is not avoidance. It is wisdom. And it produces dramatically better outcomes than forcing a conversation in a moment when reaction is more likely than response. Beyond the framework, there are specific language patterns, actual phrases and sentence structures, that signal to the people you are communicating with that you are operating from response rather than reaction. These patterns do not just change how you are perceived. They change the entire dynamic of the interaction by creating psychological safety, demonstrating emotional intelligence, and inviting genuine dialogue rather than defensive counterattack. Instead of, "You always do this," try, "I have noticed a pattern that I want to talk about." Instead of, "That is not what I said," try, "I think there may have been a miscommunication. Let me clarify what I meant." Instead of, "You are wrong," try, "I see it differently. Can I share my perspective?" Instead of, "I cannot believe you would say that," try, "That landed harder than I think you intended. Can we talk about it?" Instead of responding immediately to criticism with defense, try, "Give me a moment to think about what you just said." These are not scripts to be memorized and deployed mechanically. They are examples of the kind of language that emerges naturally when you're genuinely operating from a place of intentional response rather than automatic reaction. And the more you practice responding intentionally, the more naturally this kind of language begins to flow, not as a technique, but as an authentic expression of who you are becoming. There is a long game being played in every human relationship and every professional context, and most people are not aware they are playing it. Every time you respond thoughtfully in a moment when reaction would have been understandable, you make a deposit into the account of your reputation. Every time you choose to listen genuinely rather than defensively, you deepen the trust that the people around you have in your character. Every time you address conflict with measured, deliberate communication rather than emotional escalation, you demonstrate a quality of leadership that most people desperately want in the relationships and environments they are part of. These deposits are small individually, but they compound. Over months and years, they build something that cannot be faked, cannot be rushed, and cannot be taken away, the deep, genuine trust of the people in your life, and a reputation as someone whose words carry weight precisely because they are chosen carefully. This is the long game of responsive communication. And it is won not in single dramatic moments of perfect eloquence, but in the daily, consistent, unglamorous practice of pausing before you speak, listening before you respond, and choosing the outcome over the emotion, one conversation at a time. The most successful people in every field are not the most talented communicators by nature. They are the most disciplined ones by choice. And that choice, the choice to respond rather than react, is available to you in every single conversation you will ever have. Starting with the very next one. Chapter 9, Building an Unshakable Mind, Daily Practices for Emotional Mastery. There is a question that sits underneath everything we have discussed in this audiobook. Not the question of whether emotional mastery is possible, because by now, the answer to that should be clear. Not the question of whether it is worth pursuing, because the cost of not pursuing it, as we explored in Chapter 2, is simply too high to ignore. Not even the question of whether you are capable of it, because the science, the philosophy, and the real-world evidence we have covered together make it abundantly clear that this is a skill available to every human being willing to develop it. The question underneath all of it is this: how? How do you take everything this audiobook has given you, the understanding of your brain, the awareness of your triggers, the tools of the pause, the discipline of silence, the release of ego, the courage to feel without suppressing, the commitment to respond rather than react, and turn it into something that is not just intellectually understood but genuinely lived? How do you make emotional mastery not just a concept you agree with but a reality you embody, in the morning when the day has not yet tested you, in the afternoon when it has, and in the evening when you are tired and your defenses are low and the version of yourself you are trying to build feels furthest away? The answer is both simpler and more demanding than most people expect. You build it the same way you build anything real, through daily practice. Through consistent, deliberate, unglamorous repetition of specific habits that, over time, rewire your brain, reshape your nervous system, and reconstruct your default responses from the ground up. This chapter is your complete daily system for doing exactly that. Before we get into the specific practices, it is worth understanding clearly why daily practice, not occasional effort, not inspired bursts of self-improvement, but consistent daily engagement, is the only thing that produces lasting change in emotional behavior. We established in Chapter 1 that the brain is neuroplastic, that it rewires itself based on repeated experience. And we introduced the idea that every time you choose the pause over the reaction, you are laying down a new neural pathway. But what we did not fully explore is how neuroplasticity actually works in terms of time and repetition. Neural pathways are formed and strengthened through consistent activation. The more frequently a particular pattern of thought or behavior is repeated, the more deeply it becomes embedded in the brain's architecture, until eventually it becomes automatic. This is the mechanism behind every habit you have ever formed, good or bad. Your current reactive patterns did not develop overnight. They were built over years, sometimes decades, of repeated activation. The amygdala's hair-trigger response to certain people and situations was trained into it by thousands of experiences that reinforced the same emotional pattern over and over again. Replacing those patterns with new ones requires the same mechanism that built them, repetition. Consistent, daily repetition of new responses, new thoughts, new habits, and new practices that activate the neural pathways you want to strengthen rather than the ones you want to replace. This is why reading about emotional mastery is not enough. Understanding it is not enough. Even genuinely wanting it is not enough. The only thing that actually changes the brain is doing, repeatedly, consistently, and over a sustained period of time. The practices in this chapter are designed to do exactly that. Each one targets a specific aspect of emotional regulation and builds a specific capacity that contributes to the overall architecture of an unshakable mind. Together, practiced consistently, they create a complete daily system for the kind of lasting transformation that this audiobook has been building toward from the very first chapter. The most important emotional regulation work you will ever do happens before the day has had a chance to challenge you. This might seem counterintuitive. Why practice emotional mastery when there is nothing to be emotionally reactive about? But this is precisely the point. The morning is when you build the foundation that everything else rests on. It is when you establish the internal conditions, the clarity, the calm, the intention, that will determine how you navigate everything the day throws at you. Think of it this way. If you wait until you are in the middle of a triggered emotional state to try to access your tools for emotional regulation, you are trying to build a house in the middle of a storm. The morning is when you build the house, so that when the storm arrives, you are already inside it, grounded and protected. The first morning practice is intentional stillness. Before you reach for your phone, before you check your messages, before you expose yourself to the demands and stimulations of the external world, give yourself a minimum of 5 minutes of complete stillness. Sit quietly. Breathe deliberately. Allow your nervous system to begin the day from a place of calm rather than immediately activating it with information, obligation, and noise. This is not meditation in any complex or spiritual sense, though if meditation is already part of your practice, this is the ideal time for it. It is simply the conscious choice to begin each day with a moment of internal quiet before the external world rushes in. Research on cortisol levels consistently shows that the first 30 minutes of the day are when the stress hormone peaks naturally, a phenomenon called the cortisol awakening response. Beginning those minutes with stillness rather than stimulation gives your nervous system the best possible foundation for the emotional demands ahead. The second morning practice is intention setting. After your stillness, take 2 to 3 minutes to deliberately set your emotional intention for the day. Not a to-do list. Not a schedule. An emotional intention, a conscious decision about how you want to show up in the interactions and situations you will encounter. This can be as simple as a single sentence spoken or written quietly to yourself. Today I will choose response over reaction. Today I will listen before I speak. Today I will not give anyone the power to determine my emotional state. This practice works because of a well-documented psychological phenomenon called implementation intention, the research finding that people who decide in advance how they will respond to a specific situation are dramatically more likely to follow through on that decision when the situation actually arises. You are essentially preloading your response before the trigger appears, so that when it does, you are not deciding in the moment. You are executing a decision that was already made from a place of clarity and calm. The third morning practice is deliberate physical activation. Movement, whether it is exercise, walking, stretching, or any form of intentional physical activity, is one of the most powerful emotional regulation tools available to a human being. And the morning is the optimal time to use it. Physical movement increases the production of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a protein that supports the growth and maintenance of neurons and plays a critical role in neuroplasticity. It reduces baseline cortisol levels, increases serotonin and dopamine production, and activates the prefrontal cortex, the very part of the brain responsible for emotional regulation and deliberate decision-making. In short, physical movement in the morning literally makes your brain better at everything this audiobook is asking it to do. You do not need an intense workout. 20 minutes of brisk walking, a short yoga practice, or a simple bodyweight routine is enough to produce measurable changes in your brain chemistry and your emotional baseline for the hours that follow. The morning foundation is essential. But the day has a way of eroding it. By midday, you have navigated interactions, encountered friction, made decisions, absorbed information, and expended emotional energy in ways that accumulate into a kind of internal heaviness, a gradual drift away from the grounded, intentional state you established in the morning. The midday reset is a brief but powerful practice designed to interrupt that drift before it becomes a slide, before the accumulated emotional weight of the first half of the day begins influencing your behavior in the second half. The practice itself takes no more than 5 minutes and can be done anywhere, at your desk, in your car, in a bathroom if necessary. It has 3 components. The first is a brief body scan. Close your eyes, take 3 slow deliberate breaths, and simply notice where you are holding tension in your body. The shoulders, the jaw, the chest, the gut, these are the places where emotional activation accumulates physically throughout the day. Simply noticing the tension and consciously releasing it with a slow exhale activates the parasympathetic nervous system and begins to discharge the physical component of emotional stress. The second is an honest emotional check-in. Ask yourself one simple question: what am I feeling right now, and where did it come from? Not to analyze it extensively. Not to solve it immediately. Simply to name it and trace it back to its source. This brief act of emotional labeling, which we have discussed multiple times throughout this audiobook, activates the prefrontal cortex, reduces amygdala activity, and returns a measure of rational oversight to your emotional state. The third is a brief intention renewal. Return to the intention you set in the morning. Remind yourself of how you decided to show up today. And make a conscious recommitment to carrying that intention into the second half of the day. This takes 30 seconds. And research on goal maintenance consistently shows that brief, deliberate recommitment to an intention at the midpoint of a challenging period significantly increases follow-through on that intention to completion. Beyond the structured morning and midday practices, there are a set of micro-practices, small, brief, in-the-moment habits, that can be woven seamlessly into the fabric of your daily life and that, practiced consistently, produce enormous cumulative change in your emotional baseline over time. The first micro-practice is the pre-response pause. We have covered this extensively, but in the context of daily habit formation it deserves its place here. Every time you feel a reactive impulse rising, whether in a conversation, an email, a social media interaction, or an internal moment of self-criticism, insert a deliberate pause before responding. 3 seconds. 5 seconds. 10 if needed. This single habit, practiced consistently throughout every day, is perhaps the single highest leverage behavior in this entire audiobook. The second micro-practice is gratitude interruption. When you notice your emotional state drifting toward negativity, toward frustration, resentment, anxiety, or the low-grade irritability that accumulates in a demanding day, deliberately interrupt the drift with a specific, concrete moment of gratitude. Not a vague, generic acknowledgement of being grateful for your life. A specific, present tense observation of something real and immediate that you genuinely appreciate. This works because gratitude and negative emotional states cannot fully coexist in the brain simultaneously. Activating genuine gratitude interrupts the neural pathway of negativity and redirects the brain's attention toward a state more conducive to calm and clear thinking. The third micro-practice is conscious breathing in transitions. Every time you move from one context to another throughout your day, from a meeting to your desk, from work to home, from one conversation to the next, take 3 conscious deliberate breaths as a transition ritual. This brief practice serves as a pattern interrupt between contexts, preventing you from carrying the emotional residue of one situation into the next. It is the daily equivalent of clearing a browser's cache, a small, regular maintenance habit that prevents the accumulation of emotional clutter that slows everything down. The fourth micro-practice is the perspective question. When you find yourself becoming disproportionately activated by something, when the emotional response feels larger than the situation seems to warrant, ask yourself one question. Will this matter in 5 years? In most cases, the honest answer is no. And that honest answer does not dismiss what you are feeling, it simply places it in a perspective that gives you back your sense of proportion and your access to calm. The final component of your daily emotional mastery system is an evening practice, a brief but powerful habit of intentional reflection that serves 2 critical functions. The first function is emotional closure. The day has generated emotional experiences, some of them processed well, some of them perhaps not. The evening reflection gives you the opportunity to close the loop on the day's emotional content before you carry it into sleep and into the next day. Sit quietly for 5 to 10 minutes, away from screens, away from noise, and allow yourself to review the day's significant emotional moments. Not to judge yourself for how you handled them. Not to rehearse regrets or rehearse tomorrow's arguments. But simply to acknowledge what happened, name what you felt, and consciously let it go. If you reacted in a way you are not proud of, acknowledge it without self-punishment, note what triggered it, note what you would do differently, and release it. If you responded well in a challenging moment, acknowledge that too, because recognizing your own growth is not arrogance. It is the reinforcement of the very neural pathways you are working to strengthen. The second function of the evening reflection is progressive calibration. Over time, the habit of evening reflection creates a continuous feedback loop, a daily practice of honest self-assessment that gradually and consistently improves your emotional self-awareness, your trigger recognition, and your response quality. People who practice this consistently report that within a matter of weeks, they begin to notice patterns they had never previously recognized, recurring triggers, habitual response patterns, specific relationships or contexts that consistently drain their emotional resources. And that recognition, accumulated over months, becomes an increasingly precise map of their own inner landscape. Close your reflection with a brief acknowledgement of something you did well today, no matter how small, and a single intention for tomorrow. Then let the day go completely. It would be dishonest to suggest that these practices will transform you overnight. They will not. And anyone who tells you that lasting change in deep-seated emotional patterns happens quickly is selling you something that does not exist. What consistent daily practice does, what it reliably, measurably, and genuinely produces over time, is a progressive shift in your emotional baseline. The level of activation that used to be your default response to stress gradually lowers. The triggers that used to ambush you start to become visible from a distance. The pause that used to require enormous conscious effort starts to become automatic. The responses that used to require deliberate construction start to flow naturally from who you have genuinely become. This is not a linear process. There will be days when you lose your composure after weeks of holding it. There will be moments when old patterns resurface with a force that surprises you. There will be periods of stress or exhaustion or grief where the practices feel impossible and the progress feels entirely lost. These moments are not failures. They are part of the process. The measure of your growth is not whether you ever react, it is how quickly you recover, how honestly you reflect, and how consistently you return to the practices that you know are building the person you are becoming. The unshakable mind is not a destination you arrive at and then stop working. It is a standard you commit to and then live toward, every day, imperfectly, persistently, and with the deep understanding that the work itself is the reward. Because every single day that you choose the practice over the comfort of staying the same, you are becoming someone that life simply cannot rattle. And that person, calm, grounded, deliberate, and genuinely free, is already inside you. The practices are simply how you let them out. Chapter 10. The Calm is the Power, Living as the Master of Your Own Mind. Think back to the very beginning of this audiobook. Before the first chapter. Before the neuroscience and the philosophy and the frameworks and the daily practices. Before everything we have built together over the course of these hours. There was a question. Not one that was asked out loud, but one that was present underneath everything. The quiet, persistent question that brought you here in the first place. The question that lives in the space between who you are right now and who you know you are capable of becoming. What would my life look like if I could not be rattled? What would be different, in my relationships, in my career, in my finances, in my daily experience of being alive, if I were someone who moved through the world with genuine, unshakable calm? Not the performed calm of someone white-knuckling their way through difficulty. Not the hollow calm of someone who has simply disconnected from their feelings. But the real, earned, deeply grounded calm of someone who has done the work. Who knows themselves. Who understands their triggers. Who has built the daily practices. Who has released the ego's grip. Who has learned to feel everything and still choose wisely. That question brought you here. And this final chapter is the answer. Let us be honest about the environment you are trying to master yourself in, because it matters. We live in a world that is specifically, almost architecturally, designed to provoke reaction. Social media platforms are built on algorithms that have one primary function, to keep you emotionally activated. They have learned, through billions of data points, that outrage keeps people scrolling longer than joy. That fear generates more clicks than hope. That content designed to trigger a strong emotional response, whether that emotion is anger, anxiety, moral indignation, or tribal identity protection, is the content that spreads the furthest and fastest. The news cycle operates on the same principle. The 24-hour news environment does not reward nuance, complexity, or calm reflection. It rewards urgency, crisis, and emotional intensity. Every headline is engineered to activate your amygdala before your prefrontal cortex has had a chance to assess whether the threat is real, relevant, or worth your emotional energy. The culture of online communication has normalized reactive behavior to the point where thoughtfulness is often perceived as weakness. Where the person who pauses before responding is assumed to be losing the argument. Where the loudest, most emotionally volatile voices are amplified and the calm, measured ones are drowned out. And beyond the digital world, the pace and pressure of modern life, the financial stress, the professional demands, the relational complexity, the constant comparison and competition, creates a daily environment of low-grade emotional strain that wears down even the most disciplined person's capacity for calm response over time. This is the world you are trying to be emotionally masterful in. Not a quiet monastery. Not a controlled laboratory. Not an idealized environment where the conditions are perfect and the triggers are minimal. The real world. Loud, pressured, provocative, and relentless. And here is what makes everything in this audiobook so important, because the skills you have been building are not for easy days. They are for this world. For the daily reality of navigating a world that will consistently, persistently, and sometimes aggressively try to pull you out of your center. The calm you are building is not fragile. It is not contingent on perfect conditions. It is forged in the fire of real difficulty, and that is exactly what makes it powerful. Over the course of this audiobook you have not just consumed information. You have been constructing something, layer by layer, chapter by chapter, insight by insight. You began by understanding the architecture of your own brain, why the amygdala fires faster than the prefrontal cortex, why your reactions are not character flaws but evolutionary features, and why the space between stimulus and response is where your entire life is either won or lost. You looked honestly at what your reactive patterns have been costing you, in your relationships, your career, your finances, and your inner world, and you allowed that honest accounting to create the urgency that inspiration alone never could. You mapped your emotional landscape, identifying the specific people, situations, words, and identity threats that consistently activate your reactive patterns, and understanding that those triggers are rooted not in present reality but in the unresolved experiences of your past. You were given 4 practical, science-backed tools for creating the pause, the fundamental space between trigger and response where all of your power lies. And you understood that practicing those tools when the stakes are low is what makes them available when the stakes are high. You discovered that silence is not the absence of power but one of its most sophisticated expressions, and that the most influential communicators in every field are not the loudest but the most deliberately quiet. You examined the ego, the internal story that needs to be right, to be respected, and to be validated, and you found the difference between the fragile self-image that requires constant defense and the genuine self-worth that needs none. You confronted the dangerous confusion between emotional mastery and emotional suppression, and you learned that the path to genuine calm runs not around your emotions but directly through them, with awareness, compassion, and the courage to feel fully without being controlled. You learned how the most successful people in the world communicate, not from reaction but from deliberate, intentional response, and you were given a complete framework for doing the same in every conversation that matters to you. And you were handed a complete daily system, from the morning foundation to the midday reset to the evening reflection, that, practiced consistently, will rewire your brain and reconstruct your emotional default from the ground up. This is not a small thing you have done. You have built the foundation of an unshakable mind. There is a misunderstanding about emotional mastery that needs to be addressed directly in this final chapter, because if it goes unaddressed, it will become the source of unnecessary disappointment and self-judgment in the months ahead. Emotional mastery does not mean the end of difficult emotions. It does not mean you will never feel anger again. It does not mean anxiety will never visit you. It does not mean grief will bypass you, or fear will leave you alone, or frustration will stop appearing in your daily life. It does not mean that the people who have always triggered you will suddenly stop triggering you, or that the situations that have always challenged your composure will become effortless. What changes is not the presence of the storm. What changes is your relationship to it. The emotionally masterful person feels the anger, and chooses whether and how to express it deliberately. They feel the anxiety, and recognize it as information rather than instruction. They feel the grief, and allow it to move through them without either suppressing it or being consumed by it. They feel the fear, and act anyway, from their values rather than from their survival instincts. The storm still comes. But you are no longer in the middle of it, being thrown around by forces you cannot see or control. You are watching it from a place of grounded, stable awareness, fully present to what is happening, fully connected to what you feel, and fully in command of what you choose to do next. That is the calm that this audiobook has been building toward. Not the absence of intensity, but the presence of mastery within it. And that distinction, between calm as absence and calm as mastery, is everything. One of the things that most people do not anticipate when they begin the work of emotional mastery is the scale of its impact, not just on their own inner life, but on every person and every environment they touch. When you become someone who does not react impulsively, the people around you begin to feel safer. Not just physically or relationally safer, but psychologically safer. The kind of safe that allows people to be honest with you, to bring you their real problems rather than their managed presentations, to disagree with you without bracing for an attack. That psychological safety is the foundation of genuine intimacy in personal relationships and genuine trust in professional ones. And genuine trust, the kind built on the consistent experience of being with someone who is stable, measured, and reliably themselves under pressure, is the single most valuable relational currency in every area of human life. Your children, if you have them, are watching how you respond to difficulty. They are building their own emotional templates from the model you provide. Every time you choose the pause over the reaction in their presence, you are not just handling a moment well, you are teaching them, without a single word of instruction, that it is possible to feel intensely and act wisely. That calm is available even when the world is loud. That they do not have to be controlled by their emotions, because the person they look to most in the world is not controlled by theirs. Your colleagues and professional partners are forming their assessment of your leadership capacity based largely on how you behave in moments of pressure. The promotion that goes to the person who stays composed under fire. The partnership that forms with the person who handles conflict without escalation. The opportunity that finds its way to the person whose calm in a crisis made someone trust them with something important. These are not small professional advantages. Over a career, they compound into an entirely different professional life than the one reactive behavior would have produced. And in your own inner world, perhaps most importantly of all, the ripple effect of a regulated emotional life is a quality of daily experience that most people are actively searching for and rarely find. Peace. Not the peace of someone who has retreated from life or numbed themselves to it. But the active, engaged, fully present peace of someone who is genuinely in command of their own experience. Who wakes up without the background dread of not knowing how they will handle what the day brings. Who moves through difficult interactions without the internal cost of suppression or the external cost of explosion. Who ends each day with the quiet satisfaction of having been, as much as humanly possible, the person they intended to be. That quality of inner life is not a luxury. It is the foundation upon which everything else, the relationships, the career, the financial decisions, the creative work, the contribution, is built. And it is available to you. Not as a distant aspiration but as a daily, lived, increasingly accessible reality. As we move toward the close of this audiobook, it feels right to leave you with something concrete, a set of principles that distill everything we have covered into a form you can return to. A personal standard for how you choose to show up in the world. Not a rigid set of rules, but a living framework that can guide you back to your center on the days when the world, or your own mind, tries to pull you away from it. The first principle, the pause, is always available. No matter how fast the situation moves, no matter how intense the pressure, no matter how powerful the urge to react, the pause is always there. The space between stimulus and response cannot be taken from you. It can only be forgotten. And when you forget it, the answer is always the same: remember. The second principle, your response is your responsibility. Not what happened to you. Not what was said to you. Not the behavior of the person across from you. Your response. That one. Always. Completely. The moment you accept full ownership of your responses, not as a burden but as a power, everything changes. The third principle, emotions are information, not instructions. What you feel tells you something important about what you need, what you value, and what has been affected. But it does not tell you what to do. That decision belongs to your values, your wisdom, and your conscious intention, not to the raw emotional signal that arrived before your rational mind had a chance to weigh in. The fourth principle, calm is a practice, not a personality. You were not born calm or reactive. You developed patterns based on experience. And you can develop new ones based on deliberate choice. Every single day is an opportunity to practice. Every trigger is a training ground. Every moment of choosing response over reaction is a deposit into the account of the person you are becoming. The fifth principle, the long game always wins. In a reactive world, the person who plays the long game, who prioritizes the relationship over the argument, the vision over the frustration, the outcome over the emotion, consistently outperforms, outlasts, and outbuilds everyone around them. Patience is not passivity. It is the most sophisticated form of power available to a human being. The sixth principle, you cannot control the world, but you can master your response to it. People will disappoint you. Circumstances will challenge you. Life will be, at times, genuinely unfair. None of that is within your control. Your response to all of it is. And in that response, in that daily, imperfect, persistent choice to engage with life from your highest self rather than your most reactive one, is where your freedom lives. There is a version of you on the other side of this work. Not a perfect version. Not someone who never struggles, never gets triggered, never has a moment where the old patterns surface and the reactive impulse wins. But someone genuinely, measurably, unmistakably different from the person who was being controlled by emotions rather than choosing how to respond to them. This version of you walks into difficult conversations without the tight, defensive bracing that reactive people carry into every challenging interaction. They listen more than they speak, not because they have nothing to say but because they have learned that understanding is more valuable than being understood. They hold their silence with confidence in moments where reaction would only escalate, and they speak with a deliberate precision that makes their words carry weight precisely because they are not spent carelessly. This version of you does not need to win every argument because their sense of self is no longer staked on being right. They can receive criticism without crumbling and deliver it without cruelty. They can disagree without contempt and be challenged without collapse. They can hold their ground without aggression and release what is not theirs to carry without resentment. This version of you is present, genuinely, fully present, in the moments that matter most. Not distracted by past regrets or future anxieties. Not managing their emotional state at the expense of being actually available to the people and experiences in front of them. But here. Now. Engaged. Alive to the texture of their own experience in a way that reactive living never allowed. This is not a fantasy. This is the natural, inevitable result of doing the work consistently over time. And the work has already begun. It began the moment you chose to listen to this audiobook. It continued with every chapter, every insight, every moment of recognition where something landed and something shifted. It is continuing right now, in this final moment between the last words of this audiobook and the first moment of everything that comes after it. We began this audiobook with a statement, that we live in the most reactive era in human history. And we do. The noise is louder than it has ever been. The triggers are more numerous and more accessible than any previous generation has ever had to navigate. The pressure to react, to weigh in, to fight back, to perform outrage, to match intensity with intensity, has never been more relentless. And in the middle of all of that noise, the rarest and most powerful thing a person can possess is exactly what you have been building. A calm, grounded, deliberate, unshakable mind. Not because calm is passive. Not because it is indifferent. Not because it looks away from difficulty or retreats from challenge. But because in a world of reaction, calm is the most radical act available. Because the person who cannot be rattled cannot be controlled. Because the mind that chooses its responses rather than being driven by its reactions is a mind that is genuinely, completely, and permanently free. You came here looking for the power of not reacting. What you found is something larger. You found that the calm itself is the power. Not a tool you use. Not a technique you apply. Not a strategy you deploy in difficult moments and set aside when things are easy. A way of being. A standard you hold for yourself. A daily, living, breathing commitment to meeting the world, all of it, the beautiful and the brutal, from the deepest, most grounded, most genuinely powerful version of who you are. That is what you have built. Now go live it.